Hi, Andrew.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm good. Think I got at least twice as much sleep last night as it sounds like you got, so I'm feeling reasonably jaunty.
Yeah, I got 4 hours. Enjoy your sleep while you're young, Andrew, because you get older, it gets harder. You wake up, you worry about things. And if
Hmm.
only, see, my wish would be if God would grant me one wish, it wouldn't be that I would be able to get back to sleep. It would just be that I would know whether I'm going to be able to get back to sleep. So if I'm
Hmm.
not, I'll get up and work fine. I never got back. I lay in bed like 2 hours. I took a hot shower. I don't wanna go into detail, and nothing worked, and I deserve sympathy, but what's new? And, but anyway, how is your young life going?
It's pretty good. Although I
Yep.
got a restful 8 hours of sleep, I did have to have a little conversation when I woke up. Not quite an argument, but apparently Karina had a dream in which I cheated on her
Did you
with a,
cheat on her? I was gonna guess
yeah.
that. You son of a bitch. Yeah, she may know more than you know. She may have, powers of prophecy.
Have you ever read
Um,
Freud's, his big
I
work on dreams?
I probably read parts or much at some point. I don't think I read much. I may have read parts.
Hmm.
Um are you a fan? You're a Freud guy?
No, not particularly. I mean, his, Western civilization and his or it's just civilization and his discontents rather. That's pretty interesting. The dream
Yeah.
stuff seems a little implausible.
Yeah. Yeah, the civilization is discontents, I would say, was half right.
Mhm.
He 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 didn't fully appreciate, the extent to which the civilized part of us is actually part of our animal nature. I mean, we evolved in human society. It's not just like taking a bunch of wolves and suddenly
Mhm.
putting clothes on them and demand that they be nice to each other.
Yeah, it's a zoon politikon. Isn't that what Aristotle called us? The political animal?
I guess he did.
Mhm.
Whereas Freud's Latin, I forget the Latin, but it meant man is a wolf to man.
Mhm.
Anyway, so speaking of which, the world is falling apart amid strife and conflict. I don't know. Tom Friedman this morning said something like, talking to officials, they say there's a significantly higher chance of a regional war that the U.S. gets drawn into than there was even 5 days ago or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, I don't doubt it. I mean, the whole hospital bombing thing, uh, whatever, and I guess in the end it wasn't Israel that did it. I mean, I haven't looked into it deeply, so I wouldn't put the chances at 0%, but apparently that's the case. But even so, what it demonstrated is that this is a volatile situation,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of fronts for trouble to break out on. Iraq, Syria, Iran, Lebanon, Gaza, West Bank. Um, and I don't know. Just I mean, I think if Biden were responsible, he would be saying to Israel, "We do not want you to launch this ground invasion. Sorry, um, and we're not gonna. If it goes wrong, don't count on us." That's what a smart, you know, strategist, I think, especially one with America's interests at heart, would say. I mean, I think it would be good for Israel if they didn't proceed with it, and that's kind of what I write about in the first piece in the newsletter, actually, in the Earthling. But
Yeah, maybe we can get into that because yeah, Thomas Friedman made a similar point in his column. I think that you just referenced that unless he had a separate statement you were referencing. Um, and you just now mentioned American interests. Like, what are America's interests in all of this? Are they different from Israel's? That's something I want to get into, but maybe you can kind of walk us through your argument first.
so, yeah, I mean, it just the impetus for the piece is just that thinking. Once Israel started saying they were going to eliminate Hamas, people, including me, said, "You sure you can eliminate Hamas? And if you do, like, what's going to take their place? You sure it won't be worse? You surely don't want to do an actual occupation in Gaza. So you're going to try to what? Set up a puppet regime, and if you don't have much control over the regime? People were asking these kinds of questions, all good questions, but I just kind of thought, it's actually worse than that. It's that, the more Palestinians they kill, the more hatred there will be, and the more Palestinians in Gaza there will be next time around who want to kill Israelis. I mean, it's on the one hand, it's a cliche, hatred breeds hatred. You're just planting the seeds for the next generation of terrorists. But it's a super important dynamic, and I don't think it plays a big enough role in the discourse. The fact that it's like, when you think about it, it's like pretty weird that a bunch of guys from Gaza went in and just were willing to wantonly slaughter civilians. Why is that? Now, I don't doubt that there are Israelis who will say, well, they're just like, they're animals, they're an inferior people or something. My view is they're all just people. When people do things like this, there must be a reason. And I think a certain amount of it has to do with how many of them can point to relatives of theirs or friends of theirs who have already been killed or maimed by Israelis in past rounds of conflict. Gaza's a small place. The families are pretty big. They're extended kin networks. I think most people can say they have a relative or friend who was killed or maimed in past rounds of conflict. Maybe that's an exaggeration, but there's enough of them that Hamas doesn't have a big recruiting problem. And so I wanted to make that point. I just did two things. First of all, I went back and looked at the history of, fatalities on each side, and noted that, Israel has always done this massive retaliation thing. If you look at every year since Hamas has been governing, like the last 15 years, governing Gaza, every year when there's been like a significant number of fatalities, like more than 10 Israeli fatalities or something at the hands of Palestinians, the ratio of killed Palestinians to killed Israelis is always at least 10-1. The average over the last, I think I said 10 years, is 19-1. So they always kill way more Palestinians than Israelis get killed. And like, where has it gotten them? Obviously, deterrence didn't work. And one reason is the leaders, as usual, the people who decide whether to launch an attack, in this case, in the Hamas hierarchy, are generally not the people who are going to get killed. As we said last time, the leader of Hamas isn't even in Gaza, the political leader, and the military leader may not be either. But the other thing is just that this policy of massive retaliation is just creating more and more people in Gaza who want to kill Israelis. Okay? It's a very basic principle of human nature, but it doesn't get that much discussion. So I wanted to do that, and then I kind of dressed it up in what I hope wasn't too precious a way with reference to this Bible verse, which has always fascinated me. It's pretty famous. It's like, if your enemy is hungry, give him food. If he's thirsty, give him drink. And that's the part most people have heard. I think a lot of people think, well, it must be a New Testament verse. It sounds like, when Jesus says, love your enemy. It is a New Testament verse, but it's actually two things. It's Paul saying it in a letter to the Romans. He's actually quoting an Old Testament verse, a Hebrew Bible verse. But then the most interesting thing is the next line in the verse. It's like, if your enemy is hungry, give him food. If he's thirsty, give him drink. For by doing this, you will pour hot coals on his head. So, and there's some disagreement over what exactly that means, but it clearly means there's going to be pragmatic advantage to treating your enemy nicely, resisting the impulse that enemies normally arouse is going to work to your advantage in some way. And so I, got into that. I led with that and capped it off with that. And That's kind of the piece we and Clark did a good graphic for us. It's in the middle of the piece that just showing the ratio of deaths over the years,
Hmm.
which is kind of eye catching. Um, and so that's kind of that. Um,
Maybe if I could play devil's advocate a little bit,
mhm.
and
It's not too late. It hasn't gone out yet. I could change the whole thing.
well, I'm not gonna put forward my beliefs. I'm genuinely playing devil's advocate, in part because I know we have some subscribers and commenters who see things differently on this issue. So, for example, with this graph that you just mentioned that shows this asymmetry of casualties, it also reflects an asymmetry of power. And one thing that I'm hearing a lot of people say is, if Hamas had the military might that Israel does, if it had nuclear weapons, for example, then
Mhm.
probably Israel would be wiped off the map. I mean, there would be an asymmetry in the other direction, an even more unbalanced one if the asymmetry of military might was reversed. I don't think that exactly, does anything to weaken your argument, but I'm curious how you would respond to that because I hear people saying things like that often.
Well, I mean, if you gave them nuclear weapons and kept them cooped up in Gaza, bad things could happen. Uh, I don't see that happening. I mean, I don't. It's like, I mean, first of all, the fact is that all of these people that we call terrorist leaders and genocidal maniacs, um, especially kind of the leaders of Iran, who are often characterized by Israel as
Mhm,
having genocidal aspirations, they consistently behave like rational actors. Um, I mean, even when I say that, uh, even when I'm explaining why deterrence hasn't worked with Hamas's leaders, I'm explaining it in terms of their being rational actors,
mhm,
right? They're not getting killed. The leaders aren't being killed. That would be crazy. You do something like launching a nuclear weapon is suicidal. That's crazy. I don't see them behaving in a crazy fashion. I mean, you launch a nuclear weapon against Israel, you get nuked, and 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 that's not rational. So, um, in general, I mean, I think the valid thing you're pointing to is, uh, it's challenging to transition to the point you've got, where both the West Bank and Gaza are full of hatred toward Israel because
mhm,
of the way these people feel they've been treated. Getting from that to any kind of better place where they actually have all their rights, whether it's West Bank Palestinians being able to vote in Israeli elections or having their own state, which I think is not going to happen, essentially can't happen now. There's a challenge of getting there in a way that reaching a peaceful, stable place from here is obviously challenging. But the fact is, it gets more challenging every year.
mhm,
And Israel keeps saying, well, people disagree over who's at fault, but nobody could claim that Israel has seemed like they're in any hurry over the last, say, 15 or 20 years. Come on. You know, they're just basically screw you. We're building more settlements. You had a chance in 2000 or something. And so, as the Israeli government gets more right wing and crazier, more violence is inflicted on Palestinians and more indignities. Like, they used to respect these rules about what was supposed to happen at Al Aqsa Mosque for a long time. Israel understand, okay, we're not going Jews will not pray there. They can visit, but they can't pray. There were all these rules. Uh, and they've just broken down. And now these extremists break them all the time. And it's just the lives of Palestinians gets worse. And the thing you point to is true. The transition is hard. It gets harder every year. Um, I still say if Israel is wise, they will start trying to dig themselves out of this hole. I mean, one thing I kind of think this whole thing demonstrates is like, in a certain sense, they're kind of vulnerable. You know, if you look at all the muscles that were flexed by the other side, kind of that night that
mhm,
the hospital that something happened at that hospital. Um, you know, you realize they're vulnerable. We're vulnerable. We've got these troops in Iraq. We've got these troops in Syria. And Israel has got various actors that can make real trouble for them. And it's I mean, the good news for them again is that Iran, which does have a lot of power and has some degree of influence over these various groups that are perhaps too simply called in some cases Iranian proxies, that the good news is Iran is a rational actor.
Mhm.
But these things can get out of control. And if they do, it could get very ugly for Israel. But geez, I don't know. It's just, I mean, I just find the whole thing depressing. I'm not going to claim there's an easy way out.
Yeah, and then maybe just another point on that, the rational actor point. I mean, I think you can also step out of that rational actor frame, and your argument still holds up because there's also domestic politics to consider in Iran and Saudi Arabia, and in Arab actors, in addition to Saudi Arabia. And I think at a certain point, they're going to have trouble restraining Hamas or restraining Hezbollah in Iran's case because their people are so in solidarity with Palestinians.
Eh,
I think a point will come where even if the leaders in Saudi Arabia, for example, want to pursue diplomacy with Israel, one thing these crises with Hamas are kind of doing is making it more difficult for the Arab states and for Iran to encourage their proxies and their allies to exercise restraint.
So all these so-called proxies have their own domestic politics and some degree of autonomy.
Hmm.
And now, Hezbollah's domestic politics in some ways work in favor of restraint because they are just one political party and militia in Lebanon, and a lot of the other actors don't want to get engulfed in a war, and
Hmm.
Hezbollah has to be mindful of that. But yeah, it's also true that they've got a grassroots constituency, um, and some of the domestic politics of all these actors uh, do favor violence. And I think that's especially true of well, like the Palestinian Authority. Even I mean, you know, the West Bank and the King of Jordan. I mean, those are it varies, but um, Jordan has a big Palestinian population,
Hmm.
right? That feels ethnically aligned with the Palestinians on the West Bank, but lives in Jordan. And and the king has to deal with that, and that's why he had to cancel that visit with Biden
Right.
amid the hospital thing. Um, and to some extent, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, maybe not as much as Jordan, but yeah, they got their. I mean that's what if this whole thing was if the attack on Israel was an attempt to derail the normalization between the Arab states and Israel, that was the idea, that
Hmm.
you arouse their grassroots and make it impossible for their leaders to follow through. I
Right. Yeah,
mean,
and these protests that we're seeing in these countries, especially after the hospital bombing, are quite striking. Maybe to move the conversation along a little bit. So Biden gave a big address, although a pretty short address as well, linking Israel and Ukraine. Saying the U.S. is standing up for democracy by providing military assistance to these countries.
yeah.
So what did you think about Biden's speech?
Well, I didn't watch it. I did. I got the drift. I read about it in the New York Times, and here's a kind of a passage from David Sanger that says that this whole thing has brought out a passion, emotion, and a clarity that is usually missing from the president's ordinarily flat, meandering speeches. I kind of had a feeling that he was going to like this speech.
Mm,
He says it rang out on Thursday evening as Mr. Biden combined the two struggles, meaning Ukraine and Israel Hamas, in his Oval Office address, declaring that while President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia and Hamas, quote, represent different threats, quote, they, quote, both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy. Um, I mean, this drove me a little nuts. You could raise questions about the completely annihilate part, but what drove me nuts was the democracy part. And there's kind of two different. So, uh, I mean, a big part of the reason that we're in this mess is that although Israel calls itself a democracy, there are a couple of million, I don't know how many Palestinians in the West Bank who are ruled by Israel, but don't, get to vote, don't get due process of law, don't get to drive on the nice highways, don't this and don't that. So it's like, it was one thing to just without qualification call Israel a democracy maybe 30, 40 years ago, when you could say, well, this occupation's temporary. But I mean, come on, they are not only not leaving, they build more and more settlements every year. They clearly seem to want to take over the West Bank, and okay, but a lot of Palestinians there. And I don't, doesn't it get at least ironic to keep calling yourself this liberal democracy at some point? Even though technically these Palestinians, I mean, under international law, they're certainly not within your borders. On the other hand, under international law, neither are the settlements, which under international law are illegal. So anyway, that's what drove me nuts. Matt Duss, who used to be, Bernie Sanders' foreign policy advisor, had a different issue. He's hawkish on Ukraine. And by the way, it's interesting that, like, Matt, on Ukraine, I felt kind of, some ideological tension with him. On this, I feel a lot less. And
well, I think what he says on Ukraine is that the anti-war position is to give military aid to Ukraine because they're resisting an unjust invasion. Just to kind of provide some context for what Matt Duss thinks about that.
I mean, I'm on Ukraine's side, and I think the point he makes about Biden's speech is a good one, which is Russia is illegally occupying Ukraine, and Israel is illegally occupying the West Bank. So what Matt's saying is, if Biden wants to make a valid comparison between the two, he should join the side of the Palestinians unless he wants to join the side of the Russians. One way, that's the only way, two ways to become consistent on the issue in Matt's argument. But it is kind of interesting the way this has happened kind of generally. I've been almost surprised by how aroused the left has gotten on this issue. Have you? I mean, especially this soon after the atrocities, right?
Because that's what I was saying last week. Yeah. I agree.
And it seems real. I mean, I've even seen poll numbers that were kind of surprising about. There was some poll I saw where a slight majority of Democrats were against arming Israel or something.
Yeah,
I was
and
blown away.
most independents as well.
Yeah.
And the Republican number on that wasn't, I mean, a majority supported giving military assistance to Israel right now, but it wasn't, to my recollection, it wasn't a huge number. It wasn't a huge majority, I mean.
Yeah. So, I don't know. I was thinking, Biden, it looks like his Ukraine policy is getting more blowback on the right, and his Israel policy is getting more blowback on the left. And both of those are problems for him in the general election, to some extent, at least. Maybe Israel is the bigger one. Not that in either case a huge number of people vote on foreign policy, but I can imagine in the wake of this Israel thing, I mean, especially if it goes on and gets a lot worse, which I think there's a pretty good chance of, I can well imagine, young progressives who would have voted for Biden on pragmatic grounds because Trump is even worse, who say, screw it, and either vote for Cornel West or just don't have the energy to vote. Because this is Israel. I mean, I noticed this while my daughters were in college even, which it's now been 6 years since the younger one graduated. But, there was a vote at her college among students, and Israel just narrowly escaped a vote in the student body that would have favored BDS or something. So I think this is a problem for Biden, just politically.
On that point, there has been a couple polls. These might be outliers, but some polls suggesting that his popularity among young voters is alarmingly low. It's like
Yeah.
30% or something
Yeah.
at the moment. That doesn't mean 70% of young voters are going to vote for Trump, but it does suggest a possible problem there for him. On the thing you were saying earlier about Biden's speech, my sense was that this situation with Israel and Hamas, it's ended up reinforcing the democracy versus autocracy framework, because I think it's the only way that Biden sees a way to seem consistent. This
Mhm.
speech was about how we have to fund Ukraine and Israel, and it's a little strange because relative to Palestine, Israel is the big dog, whereas Russia is the
Right.
big dog relative to Ukraine. But the democracy thing, in his view, I think kind of smooths over this little tension. So I'm kind of expecting to hear even more of this going forward.
Yeah, it's a longstanding theme in our Israel policies that this is the bastion of democracy in the Middle East and shares our values and so on. So, but it makes sense for him to, to invoke that as a way of rendering his overall foreign policy consistent. But I mean, he's in a tough spot because to the extent that he doesn't full-throatedly back Israel, he runs into trouble with another constituency, including some donors. I don't envy him. To my mind, it's another reason that he just shouldn't be the candidate. And for that
Hmm.
matter, I think, uh, you know, being a lame duck is a good thing when you're in a foreign policy crisis anyway, because you should just do the right thing, not not be worrying about domestic politics. Uh, but God, if we could just replace him, you know,
Well, I
uh,
think I think his replacement would probably have the same problem. I mean, I saw that I think Gavin Newsom went to Israel or said
yeah,
he had plans to. It's weird on both sides. There's a kind of shadow primary. These shadow primaries look different. In the Republican case, they're on the stage having debates, but it's still in the shadow of Trump, and
mm,
they're kind of hoping that something will happen, maybe with Trump's indictments that will make him unable to be president, and then one of them will be president. And then on the Democratic side, it's kind of the same thing. There's a shadow primary. Maybe Biden's age is going to affect him, or his unpopularity is going to affect him in some way. And I think Gavin Newsom, it's kind of interesting that governors more than Congress people are angling here, maybe because in Congress there's kind of a mechanism to enforce this kind of conformity. But I do think that there are some Democrats trying to step into the wings here, just in case.
yeah. Now, Kathy Hochul, I assume her going to Israel was more about just New York politics. I mean, I guess people may talk about her as a presidential candidate. Gavin Newsom, I'm sure he has a constituency in California. Is happy to see him show support for Israel. But the first thing I thought when he went there is, maybe he is jockeying for, to be the presidential nominee. Better hurry. But
Hmm.
God, what a mess the world is in.
Yeah, maybe on that, I just wanted to mention, the possibility of regional war or even World War III. You alluded kind of to this already, but this week the U.S. shot down cruise missiles coming from Yemen, possibly
Yeah,
headed for Israel.
yeah,
I mean, then
they were.
also this week, I don't know if you saw this, but Putin sent fighter jets with so-called hypersonic missiles to patrol the Black Sea. And he said they would be monitoring what is happening in the Mediterranean Sea. He's referring there presumably to these carrier strike groups that the US
Whoa.
sent to the Mediterranean. And those carrier strike groups are within, missile range of these fighter jets in the Black Sea that Putin sent. So there are some more flashpoints emerging, some more, possibilities of a wider war, possibly a much wider war. What do you think about that?
I think he'd be pretty damn reluctant to attack an American aircraft carrier, but, uh, again, it all depends so much depends on domestic politics.
Hmm.
I mean, maybe in a certain sense, in terms of the likelihood of world war breaking out, maybe in a certain sense, it's good news that the Ukrainian offensive, basically failed. So he's not feeling, I think, super threatened. As threatened politically as he would be feeling if they had, if Ukraine had cut off the Crimean land
Hmm.
bridge or something. Um, but, and I think, he's again, I think these people do tend to be more rational actors than they're given credit for. All the people we call crazy, Putin, you know, Khamenei in Iran, the head of Hamas, and all the people called genocidal maniacs. They tend to be more rational actors than we give them credit for. But the two problems, well, the problem is domestic politics, and those domestic politics can put them in a corner where they have to do something reckless. Even if the international politics don't. And of course they're related. I mean, if we attack Iran, for example, I mean, they have to fight back. I mean, just as if Iran, it's like after Trump had that Iranian assassinated and Iran launched a missile and really, seems to have arranged to tip America off so it would evacuate the barracks, and Iran laid down those missiles on the barracks and blew them away, and even gave concussions to some of the Americans who were in the bomb shelter, apparently. That was a close call, because if they had killed Americans, Trump, of course, would have had to respond. And that's the way these things get started. Iran had to do something. It showed enough restraint not to kill any Americans, but it felt it had to at least blow up some American barracks. And that's the way these things get started. And that's why, notwithstanding what rational actors everyone is, they can't, you can wind up with world wars and things where both sides just suffer massively.
Right. So anything else you want to add on Israel before we move on?
No, I'm just very alarmed. We'll see. There seems to be very little hope that Biden will try to use any real leverage to kind of steer Israel toward, dramatic restraint, like not invading Gaza or anything like that. So,
right. So what do you want to? All right, go ahead.
Well, we should maybe say so. This is a podcast we do sometimes. We haven't been doing it every week, but this is the second week in a row. We always do it at least twice a month and talk about the Friday newsletter, the Earthling. It's been entirely behind a paywall. Now we've started, last week we kept the whole thing outside a paywall. I think maybe this week what we should do, unless on reflection we decide that everything that just transpired is embarrassing, in which case we should put everything behind a paywall, is maybe this part, the Middle East discussion, could be public, but now we'll talk about the rest of the newsletter, and anything else that comes to mind in that part will be behind the paywall. If anybody wants to listen, or for that matter, just support us, they can become paid subscribers to the newsletter at the non-zero Substack place, or click the link in the show notes to the podcast. And after that, they can set up the podcast feed that just always has all this stuff. And the next best thing is to become an unpaid subscriber to Non-Zero Newsletter. And the third best thing is if you're listening to this on YouTube, to smash the like button, which helps. And you know what the fourth best thing is, Andrew?
I have no idea. What is it?
I think your attention, was straying, Andrew. This is pretty easy. I didn't mention rate and review. Although, there's also merch. We have non-zero merch.
That was going to be my guess, actually, because I was already planning a segue to talk about that. So maybe that is the segue. So this is the first week that we're offering some non-zero merch. That's going to be the second item. I think I'm going to include a picture of the black hat that has the /0 logo on it. So, Bob, which of these products, if any, caught your eye?
I thought they all look cool. In promotional terms, I kind of like the ones that also have the URL on them. But you may be right that if people are walking around in a hat or shirt that just has the non-zero logo, which I grant you, mathematicians will think means the null set, that people will go, "What is that? Is that the null set?" And I'll say, "No, it's the non-zero logo at," and then it'll just repeat the URL. That could happen.
Yep, that's the goal. Some of the products, including some of the shirts, have the URL on the back.
They do.
But the hat just has the zero, the /0. No, I think the black hat is the one that I'm gonna go for. But anyway, in today's
I should get
Earthling,
one.
the second item has a link to the merch. It's through Cafe Press.
Okay.
So
That's
go
in
ahead.
the non-paywalled part of the Earthling?
Definitely. Yeah.
Okay, and so then this can be the point at which we go into overtime, and that discussion of the merch was in the public part of the podcast. And thanks everybody who just listened this far. But thanks more to the people who are going to hear what we're about to say.